Howdy, BHRCers. You can find every episode of Why People on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever else you get your podcast content. On this episode of Why People, episode number 12, we're excited to chat with Lisa Amaya Price, the SVP and CHRO at Deciphera Pharmaceuticals, a really cool background and journey into the lead HR and people seat. Let's do it. All right. Hello, folks. Welcome to another episode of Why People. Why People is a Boston HR Council production. For those first-time listeners, the BHRC is one of the largest people and HR executive communities in the world, with just over 1,200 HR and people executives making up the community. I am joined by BHRC co-founder and Why People co-host Paul Roberts.
Hello, everyone. Happy to be here. Why People only interviews the top talent in HR, and today is certainly no exception.
Awesome. Thanks, Paul. And really excited to announce our guest today. Lisa Amaya Price is the SVP and CHRO at Deciphera Pharmaceuticals. Lisa, thanks for joining us.
Sean and Paul, what a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, we're excited, Lisa. Really excited to learn a little bit more about you and your journey, the feedback, and really the inspiration of Why People is that large BHRC community said, hey, geez, there's a lot of great folks within this group. We'd love to learn a little bit more about them and their journey and how they got to where they are. So that's kind of the nature of the conversation. So, Lisa, with all that said, we'd love to share with the audience a little bit of your backgrounds. Go as far back as you want, but tell us a little bit about kind of who you are and help situate the conversation.
Sure, Sean. I think maybe I'm a little unusual in that I'm a second generation HR professional. My dad was in HR, but I took a very long and winding road to get into HR because, like many rebellious teenagers, doing what my dad did not seem cool at the time. And I was very, and I still am a musician. I classically trained clarinetist and I sing and do some performing still. But I think I tried that, and what always frustrated me, I remember in college, I did an internship sort of managing a chamber music festival. And I was like, okay, I like the music, but gosh, artists are very difficult to work with. So very, very conscious of they're not on time and they're a little flaky and there's the ego thing. So I was always thinking about the way people work together. And that was very important to me. And so I did some traveling after I finished my undergraduate degree. I lived in Germany and Japan, which was super fun, and thought I was teaching English and doing some studying on my own. And so when I came back to the US, I said, gosh, maybe this teaching thing is for me. And I taught at the high school level. I taught at a little bit at Boston University, Bay State College, places like that. And again, wow, I really like working with these students, but the whole administration thing and just there's probably better ways of working together. So I went to my dad and he's like, Lisa, remember this HR thing that I do? That's kind of what we do. I'm like, oh, really? So I kind of figured it out, that's something that I was really, really interested in. And fortunately, I was able to parlay some sort of summer jobs, summer internships. I probably spent in the basement in an office building in Charlestown filling 401k packets when we still did everything, by hand, without the internet, without emails, voice. You'd come home after lunch, or come back to the office after lunch. You'd have 52 voicemails or fax. The fax machine was new with the curly paper. So I had done a few of those jobs in HR and was able to kind of parlay that into sort of my first real HR job, which was as an immigration coordinator for a software company in the 80s. So got a lot of practice doing H-1B visas and green cards and trade NAFTA visas, which is a great experience. It's something that I fall back on even today. And then I wound up at a software company, and that was sort of my first head of HR job for a small entrepreneurial company. It was about 30 people. We were starting to web enable this insurance software. And we were privately held, and the CEO said, "Okay, Lisa, I don't believe in paying agency fees." And I'm like, "Okay. And we need you to find us actuarial programmers." So for any of your listeners who are into the computer sciences or high tech, so we need somebody who's like a math genius and can pass all those actuarial exams for the insurance industry and wants to program. So it was really, really complicated. And we were able to innovate sort of in the 90s, the mid 90s, telecommuting, using SharePoint, using text messages, sort of that virtual thing that we all take for granted today. We were early adopters of that because wherever we could find either actuaries who wanted to learn to program or programmers who wanted to be actuaries, wherever they wanted to live was fine. And we found a way to make that work. So that was kind of a formative experience for me. And I was talking to the CEO because we were recruiting from all over the world. What can I do? What can I do to grow in my career and be more credible, really have that full seat at the table? And he's like, Lisa, you need to learn. You need to get out of this whole, HR speak trap that you can get in. And you need to be able to, speak well with finance and all the other functions. He's like, you should really go to business school. And he sort of steered me in the direction of Babson because he was a big fan of Babson and that whole entrepreneurial mindset. And so I did get my MBA at Babson in 2005. And it really did make a difference, in thinking about, it made a huge difference in my practice of HR because I think of myself first and foremost as a business person. What business problem are we trying to solve? What's the data? What are the financials? What are the objectives? And then you can say, okay, what can the people agenda add to increase the chances of success? And do we have the right people in the right place at the right time, the right capabilities? Because if you don't, you're not going to be successful in getting that business objective succeeded. And I think, I found in my practice over time that, board members, senior leadership, sometimes they're blind to that you can get surprised. Maybe there's there's turnover and you don't have a successor for somebody who's in a key role. And all of a sudden it's getting in the way of achieving your objectives, or it creates undue stress on the organization. So really trying to create resilient organizations, making sure we have bench strength regardless of the size of organizations is something that I've really become focused on in my HR practice. So after sort of that MBA experience, I did some time in the media and communications industry, which was really interesting. I worked for a global newspaper company, also a PR company, PR and communications firm, so more in the professional services arena. So that taught me, in the newspaper business, you have huge turnover, 70% turnover of the salespeople, and that's your revenue driver. So really being on top and being proactive with that. And then professional services, your product is the people. And so making sure you had that pipeline of talent, the interns, and really careful, hyper focus on that career pathing to retain people, and thinking about, what configuration of people do you need on each client's project? So sort of having that horse trading, how do we optimize the level of talent we put forth to handle client issues? So in about 2008, I was recruited out of the communications firm by Biogen. And so that was my first foray into the life sciences. And I absolutely loved it. It was a great way. I got the role there because of my experience in IT. They were welcoming a new chief information officer, Ray Pollocky, and he really wanted to transform the IT organization. And I was thinking, 200 IT people, how hard can this be? You go into life sciences and, it's not just the computers we use for business purposes. They have like 50,000 applications because there's computer stuff going on in the labs and the manufacturing facilities. And you need all of these different experts in a very highly regulated industry. So it was a great way to get to know life sciences. And, once I got a taste of it, there's been no going back. So I've been in the life sciences since 2008. So I was at Biogen for about 9 years. And then that's where I started. My mentor at the time, who was the head of HR, was like, Lisa, you got what it takes to be a CHRO. And I was like, oh gosh, how do I get into that? Who's going to take a chance on me? And it was tough, but I did get a role at Takeda to be the head of HR for their vaccines business, which at the time was the only vertically integrated business unit at Takeda. So it was a really great size to sink my teeth into the whole enchilada, if you will. Manufacturing, quality, commercial, the R&D, the whole thing, about 800 people in a very global group. Working globally is something I'm incredibly passionate about. I grew up overseas. I love dealing with people from different cultures. So at Takeda Vaccines, we had about 600 of our employees who were in Japan. And I spoke a little Japanese. And so that was just kind of a fun part of the job. Involves a lot of travel, of course, which was a little exhausting with the family life, but still very exciting. So that's kind of where I got the sense, really, what is it like to own the whole business and work with the leadership team? I then worked on the Shire acquisition, so I got some really great M&A experience at Takeda. And then I think when I was doing that, it got a little bit scary, if you will. 55,000 employees on a spreadsheet and trying to figure it out. Like, this feels a little bit too big for me. My roots was more the small company. And even my time at Biogen, I got to know most of the employees pretty well. So I was looking for something a little bit smaller. So I got my first real CHRO opportunity at a public company where I had, comp committee and all of that at a company called Scholar Rock, which is a rare disease company that's in Kendall Square. I think when I left them, they were almost 200 employees. And it was a great experience. Just learning how to do the comp committee, do the succession planning is very important. We had some turnover on the executive team, so working on those searches was really a great experience. At how do you manage those transitions with the board? And then during the pandemic, I got a call from a private equity company based in London called LGC that had hopes at the time. They were thinking maybe they might go public because they were having a lot of luck creating sort of tests for the COVID vaccine, these high throughput tests. And they had grown by leaps and bounds to about 4,000 employees through M&A activity. So I was with them for most of the pandemic. It was an exciting ride, working remote from the US. A lot of the leadership team was in the UK. We had a few people in Canada and here in the US. So a lot of travel, really leveraging that global experience and doing a lot of M&A activity in an environment where you couldn't visit the businesses because of the pandemic travel. So the pandemic restrictions, excuse me. That's what I meant to say. So that was an exciting adventure. But when the pandemic died down, the company was changing its direction and thinking, they really wanted to stay in the private equity space. And I had to talk with the CEO and I said, I'm really kind of a public company type of gal. That's what I'm a little more comfortable with. And that's how I learned about this wonderful opportunity at Deciphera, which I just finished my 1-year anniversary in August. So this has been another experience where it's the first time the head of HR has reported to the CEO. So I'm sure some of your listeners, that might be a familiar journey. Sometimes a company gets to a certain stage, HR might be reporting to a COO or to the CFO, and then they get to a certain stage and say, hey, you know what, maybe we need HR to be a little bit more strategic. So it's been a wonderful experience. Deciphera is an oncology company. We have a commercial product. We hope to have a few more. We have the end-to-end. We do our commercialization ourselves in Europe, so I can leverage that global experience. And the HR team is only about 12 people. So it's really great for me to mentor and develop and build the team as this company looks to scale. So it's kind of a Goldilocks experience for me right now. Not too big, not too small, complicated enough, and global. So it's been a great journey. So I said a lot.
No, Lisa, what a cool story, and thank you for kind of giving us the foundation of our conversation. I mean, what a great journey with a lot of cool and different stops. The first thing I wrote down, you're the first one of our guests that is a second generation HR executive. We've had quite a few folks that have had business executives in their in their families or in their parents, but never a true descendant of an HR executive. So that's really cool. I have to ask, when you said, you kind of came back around and your dad said, what you're talking about is HR, right? The coordination of people and communication and talent strategy that you were talking about, early on in your music days. Again, I don't know about your dad or anything like that, but how did that go as your HR career kind of picked up? How did that relationship go for you?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It was great. So my dad retired, maybe in the early 2000s. And he started his career at Raytheon and then finished at, I think it was a company called Seabridge. It was during the .com boom and bust. But he was head of HR at EMC for a while and at Wang. So he had some really big jobs, dealing with boards. And I think during his career, like the 401k vehicle was a brand new thing. So selling that to the company and implementing benefits, implementing training programs and Six Sigma programs and things like that. So it's funny. Sometimes I do have days or months I'm like, oh, Dad used to talk about this when he came home, when I asked him, how he was doing, and I wasn't really paying that much attention. But a lot has changed too. Sarbanes-Oxley, working in pharma, we have different rules. So sometimes my dad and I are chatting. He's like, oh yeah, we didn't have to do that back in my day. So it's kind of fun comparing notes. But some things don't change because human beings are human beings, dealing with executive team dynamics, communication with the board, succession planning. Not that much has changed.
Yeah.
Regard. Yeah.
And you shared something, Lisa, that I thought was, a lot of it was super interesting, but, and I didn't know your background as a classically trained musician and someone that still plays. You said that kind of the lack of coordination from an administration standpoint, when you were doing some of that teaching, kind of had a light bulb effect for you as far as the work and the work that you're doing now. But I'm curious, is there any crossover between the actual skill and talent of being a musician and what you do in your everyday role as a CHRO, Chief People Officer now?
Yeah. Oh gosh, thanks for asking that question. I mean, there's a lot. I think there's a lot of what we do in HR, especially in the HR business partner part of the job, is pattern recognition. Yeah, I mean, there's data, right? But you need to look for patterns, and it is almost like if you were conducting an orchestra or listening, something's a little out of tune, and you're like, okay, something's just a little bit off in the data, and how do we analyze that, localize it, and intervene appropriately so that there's harmony again. So the harmony is sort of like workability, when things are working well, when a team is operating well, when a process is operating well. It sort of sounds good. That's the way a lot of people say they're visual people. I'm very much a listening person, and it's not just sounds, but it's just kind of looking for patterns in data and connections. So yeah, I spent a lot of time in my undergraduate degree, looking at huge, complicated scores and looking, why did Beethoven use that chord there? What was he trying to achieve? So it's a science in a way, but not in a traditional hardcore science way. So that's totally relevant. And then, just playing with others through and listening. That's so important in what I do. The better I listen, the better I lead, I find.
Yeah, that's really cool, Lisa, that you can kind of, that's a pretty sharp parallel. That wasn't too far of a stretch, as far as the musician piece and the executive piece. That's really cool. Another kind of note I took when you were helping us with kind of the background of your journey was you went from an immigration person right into, and even though it was a smaller company, right into being the kind of the everything HR person. Just curious, in that transition, when you look at the spectrum that is and even was back then HR, were there a lot of things that you didn't know, that you were kind of, stumbling upon? How did you kind of round out, the areas that you were, maybe hadn't done before or didn't have much background in?
Yeah. It was a lot of learning by doing, for sure. So yeah, I call it was definitely a chief cook and bottle washer job. It's like, so I did payroll and the recruiting and dealt with employee relations matters and things like that. So I reached out I used to attend a lot of NARA events, which was really great for when I had an early career, the early career experience, developed a network of people. So to phone a friend, working with our general counsel and external counsel when needed to get up to speed. Actually doing payroll teaches you lots about the different state laws and things like that. We had ADP at that time, and I actually found the folks at ADP very helpful. To just learn some of that nuts and bolts stuff. And then just learning how to partner with the business to figure out how to build training programs, because we would bring people in to teach them about actuarial science or the software bit. And so actually sitting in those training programs, and this is what I talk to my people a lot about, is sort of anthropology. So you just have to go and observe and learn the business. And then you can figure out what HR things, there's enough on the internet, there's enough advisors out there that you ask for help. If it's a first time, really be prepared. Get the advice you need, especially in a small company environment, because sometimes the consequences of mistakes could be really high. And another thing I learned at that time, I was a bit of a perfectionist. I was always a straight A student, all that stuff. But I'm not, don't tell anybody, but although I'm saying it on this podcast, I'm not the most detail-oriented person. I think that goes with being into the pattern recognition and all of that. So I've learned sort of the hard way to really build in a lot of extra time. If I have to deliver something on my own, to make sure I have enough time to step away, go back and just check all the details, or surround myself with people who will double check things when it's detailed. Because I used to beat myself up, payroll mistakes and things like that. I'm like, oh no, the sky is falling. And one of my coaches said, look, as long as you correct the mistake, no, they're not paying you to do payroll. They're paying you for all this other stuff. That's more value add. And that person was right. It just allowed me to relax. And occasionally when there was a bit of a mistake, usually I just went to ADP and fixed it, or I could tell the employee, say, hey, this thing happened. Here's how we're going to make it right. And everything was cool. So just learning how to let go of that stuff and what you're good at and what you're not so good at, and how to mitigate that and build in enough time and connections with people was a very important lesson to learn early in my career.
Thanks for sharing that, Lisa. And another note I have here, and I found really interesting, was I thought it was great that you were that somebody kind of pushed you a little bit to go grab your MBA. And the timing's interesting because we chat with a lot of folks that, the value of their MBA is different, right? Some folks say, geez, I haven't gotten a ton out of it. Folks get it at different stages. Some people get it, right after the undergrad. I think it's interesting that you, number one, were kind of nudged a little bit by by an executive teammate, But also number two, you went and got it at Babson, obviously a great institution, but you got it, after and during, you actually doing the work kind of, in real time. So just curious, how much of that do you think impacted the value you got out of the program?
I think a lot. Yeah, I really do. Well, especially coming from my background, I didn't study business undergrad. I went to small liberal arts college, studied music and some biology, was biology minor, so I liked science. So even to apply to Babson, I had to go take some economics classes at Harvard Extension School to meet the prerequisites. So it kind of introduced me to a whole, how do I get in the mind of the business? Because I think before it's easy for HR to drink its own Kool-Aid too much. Sometimes we have our own jargon. Sometimes we can maybe be too employee and career, it's all about the career development for the people. You can get put into that world, which is good. It's nothing wrong with it. But then you need to kind of step back and say, what about the business? There's sort of this balance, this yin yang between what's good for the individuals and the talent and what's good for the business. There's some constructive tension there. You want to find that overlap. So I think it helped me think about that and speak the language of other people in the business. If they're thinking about, raising money or what are the macroeconomic factors that are putting pressure on the business, to just really be part of the conversation, and then be able to articulate what we need to do from a people strategy standpoint in the language of the business instead of them having to learn all the HR jargon.
Yeah. It's neat that you say that, Lisa. So this is our 12th episode of Why People. And we've chat with a ton of your peers on a weekly and daily basis. All these conversations are super different, but that is the one common thread that everyone talks about is really being rooted in the business, whatever business you're in, and being able to approach the objectives that you need to from the HR and people space through the lens of the business, whether it be just even to your point, general jargon and language, or how you're approaching it from the rest of the executive leadership team. So that's really neat, and kudos to you to be able to round yourself out that way while still flying the plane. And that's as someone, I also I got my MBA while doing the work. It's not an easy program. It's not you don't chip away 15 minutes before bed. It's there's some work required there. So kudos.
Yeah.
Well, Lisa, this is great, right? So we've really talked about your journey. We've been able to ask some questions about some of the really cool, unique parts of it. What we like to do, kind of on the back end of the conversation here, is talk a little bit about the future. So if you wouldn't mind, tell us a little bit about how you think about HR and people, kind of moving forward. What are you thinking about? What changes have you seen, or, not to sound too cliche, but what keeps you up at night when you think about the work?
Yeah, I think especially now, I think a lot about the Ulrich model, with the COEs and the HRBPs, and how do I adapt that so to avoid the potential pitfalls of that structure, to make not only HR careers more interesting for HR people, but to better serve the business. In my experience, sort of the pitfalls of the Ulrich model are HRBPs can go native. You get a lot of rewards for going native with your client group. And then the COEs are a little out of touch. They're not creating field-ready solutions because they're not embedded with the business. It can be one of the watch-outs of the model. So I'm really obsessed with trying to build, HR teams that are a little bit more agile, so that, yes, you might be assigned to some client groups, but maybe you have some L&D in your background. So maybe you're a co-lead of, a global process or an enterprise-wide process for L&D strategy, so that you have some say and responsibility for something across the enterprise while still being accountable for your client group. And then also making sure that people who are in the center have ways of getting regular reports of, here's what's going on in this function, here's what's going on there, so that when they are doing their work, HR operations or talent acquisition, they have some of that context in mind instead of just blindly following a process. So that's something that keeps me up at night. How do we fine tune that so that we can, get the right HR team members involved sort of very flexibly, or use external support when needed so that we're just not siloed. It's so easy, especially with the pandemic and the hybrid working style. I think folks get a little bit isolated and siloed.
And
so that's what I'm obsessed with right now, is how to figure that out.
Yeah, that's neat, Lisa. HR and people org design. That's something that we see within the Boston HR Council community. It's kind of a hot topic. I don't think anyone has it all the way figured out, right? It's not a right or wrong. It's oftentimes a fit, right? It's a little bit different everywhere. Do you have any plans to put something out there, whether it's a white paper or publish something? It seems like you've spent a lot of time thinking about it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good idea. I just did implement a new model for HR at Deciphera, but I kind of want to see how it turns out for a couple of months, and maybe we'll have a little. We're actually doing a workshop on it internally in September to really go through some use cases. This is a great practice. Even doesn't have to be HR, any part of the business. If you're looking at your org model and you make some tweaks and say, well, let's look at some use cases. What are we going to do the same, and what are we going to do that's different in this new model? So we're pressure testing that. But it's basically this concept where the senior HR VPs also own one or two global processes instead of hiring, an L&D person. Part of it's the size we are, so that we can get the benefits of having an L&D strategy without having a dedicated headcount to it. But that dictates, who I hire or how I develop the HRBP, so that they develop some expertise and learn how to apply it, not just for their function, but for the whole company. So we're gonna see how it goes, and if there's something to report, I will definitely do that, because we're kind of at that interesting. We're about 340 people globally. And that's when you do need some of that area of specialization and focus.
Right. And I promise I wasn't putting you on the spot, Lisa. So if it makes sense, cool. But if not, no worries. So this has been great. And we love to end this conversation, Lisa, with a little bit of time, advice for maybe some folks that are early on in their journey, right? And listen to this and say, wow, that sounds really cool. I would love to be the leader of an HR and people function. So I have one question that's super specific, and then, with a second question that's more general. But, one of the really cool, I guess, unintended consequences of the Boston HR Council is that we've had a lot of folks reach out to us that are totally outside of the HR function and say, hey, HR really interests me, but unfortunately I'm a school teacher, a police officer, right? A something totally different. And certainly you can understand. Any advice, Lisa, to somebody who's in a totally different profession that might be interested in getting into HR as a profession?
Sure. I think one good place to start is in recruitment, because if whatever profession you're in now, you could find out, well, maybe I could recruit people who do what I do for institutions or companies that are recruiting those people, and you already have that expertise. So you can leverage your expertise in knowing what it's like to recruit those folks. So that's a great entree. Yeah, just don't be afraid to go sideways or try something outside of your comfort zone to get the foot in the door. Even being an executive assistant for an HR team, I've seen a lot of people break into the profession very well through that, or recruiting coordinators and things like that. So that's more at the entry level. But if you're doing a career change, I think recruitment is a great place to start. And
Right.
to me, it's the core, it's the heart of what HR does. It's all about having the right people in the right time, right people, right place, right time, right? So
That's great advice, Lisa. And then I'd say kind of the last question here from an advice standpoint is the Boston HR Council. The profile for a council member is director level or higher. So we have a lot of directors in there kind of doing the work, rooted in a lot of operational components to the function that are super interested in kind of climbing that career ladder to someday be, at the in the C-suite and leading the function overall. Any words of wisdom or advice to that person that might be earlier on in their executive journey?
Yeah, sure. Maybe two main pieces of advice. One, make sure you do at least a year well out of your comfort zone. So if you're an HRBP, try compensation or talent acquisition. Make sure you have some mastery of more than one discipline in HR that you've tried, preferably one that's uncomfortable to you. I think that's very important because it will help you collaborate and understand the other component of HR. And then when you're in the leadership role, you'll have a better understanding of how to make all the parts work together. I think that's very important. And then probably two, to just really, really become financially literate, very data literate. I mean, that's incredibly important when you're in the C-suite, when you're dealing with public companies and all of the, sort of reporting and governance that's required. Learn about corporate governance. They don't really teach you about that in business school. There's a great organization called the National Association for Corporate Directors. They have a website, and you can read up a little bit on what's involved in corporate governance. Serving on the board of a nonprofit is something that I've also done, or of a pseudo-governmental organization. I was on a workforce board. I was on the finance committee. So that was great because it wasn't just wearing my HR hat. So really walking a mile in different shoes, I think is very important. It gives you that perspective to sort of have that credible seat at the table.
That's great advice, and certainly not easy. I love the advice of getting into a different role that's outside of your comfort zone. Do you have an example, Lisa, for you? Which role that was? Are you at liberty to say?
Sure. Well, I think there was two. I mean, being in the at Takeda, when my last role there was not in HR. I was reporting to the head of the integration office, who reported to the CEO. So I was way out of my comfort zone. I was dealing with a bunch of, management consultants and, really heavily data oriented and, just a completely different mindset. So that's one example. And also I, for a period of time, I led talent acquisition at Biogen after having been in the, sort of talent acquisition programs and role, but where I helped work on their contingent workforce management program that wound up managing over 50 million in spend globally, so doing something that was really more entrepreneurial in the middle, like it almost felt like a profit center in the middle of the company. So those were some things that were a little bit outside the norm that I did. And they were kind of scary at the time, but pulled it off.
Well, Lisa, this has been an amazing conversation. What a cool journey for you, and really appreciate you giving us some insight and some advice to our community members. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, guys. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, looking forward to seeing you out there in the community soon.
All right. Thanks, Sean. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Lisa.
Take care.